Pastor Dalrock writes another great article called Rubbing Body Parts Together, where he writes that there is a deep aversion in modern Christians to the idea that both spouses, not just husbands, owe sex to each other, as clearly written in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says that pastors and theologians are among the most uncomfortable with the idea that husbands, and wives both, but husbands are entitled to sex in marriage. And this is true, and it is tangled up with the modern elevation of romance and emotion, which is what purifies sex, the romance and the emotion. The belief is that marital sex needs to be purified by romance, or it is unseemly and bad if it's not purified by romance. Now, the other view, the old view, 100 years ago, or probably more, was that marriage is what purifies sex. Not romance, but marriage is what purifies sex and makes it holy. All right, so he says that you can see this as far as pastors and theologians not liking this idea that a man is owed sex by his wife. And the reverse. The wife is owed sex by her husband as well. But, of course, the man, on average, is going to have a higher sex drive than the wife. He says you can see this in the wording of both Al Mohler and Dr. Russell Moore. Now, Al Mohler's a great guy. He was the Southern Baptist Convention head. Russell Moore is a good guy, too. I think he's kind of gone off the rails a little bit, but he's still pretty good. But anyway, Al Mohler makes this clear when he writes, many individuals, especially young men, hold a false expectation of what sex represents within the marriage relationship. Since the male sex drive is largely directed towards genital pleasure, men often assume that women are just the same. While physical pleasure is certainly an essential part of the female experience of sex, it is not as focused on the solitary goal of genital fulfillment as is the case with many men. Okay, this is Al Mohler saying this. It says, by definition, sex within marriage is not merely the accomplishment of sexual fulfillment on the part of two individuals who happen to share the same bed, rubbing body parts together. Rather, it is the mutual self-giving that reaches pleasures both physical and spiritual. The emotional aspect of sex cannot be divorced from the physical dimension of the sex act. Though men are often tempted to forget this, women possess more and less gentle means of making that need clear. Now, of course, when he says women possess the less gentle means of making that need clear, means they would withhold sex if they don't feel like they're in the mood, they don't feel romance, they don't feel emotionally available, blah, 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 whatever. Al Mohler goes on and says, therefore, when I say that a husband must regularly earn privileged access to the marital bed, I mean that a husband owes his wife the confidence, affection, and emotional support that would lead her to freely give herself to her husband in the act of sex. And according to 1 Corinthians 7, if she isn't in the mood, then she is tempting him to sexual sin. Okay? I mean, that's clearly in right there, and you can't argue with that. So Al Mohler is saying that romance and emotion is needed to make marital sex spiritual. Otherwise, it is dirty. A priestess is needed to bless the marriage bed to make it holy and pure, and this priestess is, of course, then the person in the marriage who is the expert in marriage emotion, which is the wife. Now, maybe there's some really crazy marriages where the husband is way more emotional and more romantic than the wife, but that'd probably be, the exception. Is that telling her to stop the nonsense and have sex with her husband when she isn't channeling this emotional holiness is horrifying to Al Mohler. That would be just rubbing body parts together, and you can't have that. That's terribly unholy to do that, even though that is what 1 Corinthians 7 literally says. All right. Rubbing body parts together is what Mohler explains is the real problem with pornography. Not fundamentally that it is channeling sexual desire outside of marriage, but that it is channeling sexual desire outside of emotion. Okay, now this is really profound. The problem is, as Moeller explains it, that when men can view pornography, then their wives' ability to control them via denial of sex is weakened, and this means that the priestess or the wife can't enforce the need to bless sex with romantic love, the emotional romantic love. Likewise, Russell Moore explains that pornography is satanic not because it is focusing sexual desire outside of marriage, which it does, but because, this is Dr. Russell Moore, it is satanic because it lacks romance and emotional intimacy. Okay, so here's what Dr. Russell Moore says. Pornography is uniquely satanic because it drives you further and further and further from intimacy. Why? Because there is an occult pull upon you that is driving you toward the kind of mystery and the kind of intimacy that you are designed to find in the one flesh union. It severs that away from real life, covenant flesh and blood love in such a way that you become numbed over to the joy of sexual intimacy itself. He goes on to say, pornography lures you in with sexiness and then totally eviscerates your capacity for sexual intimacy. Pornography will move in and destroy you because it will start to create you into the kind of person for whom intimacy is simply body parts rubbing together, not one flesh. So I guess it was Dr. Russell Moore who actually said the simply body parts rubbing together thing. So he is saying, to sum that up again, marriage is not what purifies sex. It is romantic, emotional intimacy that purifies sex in here. And pornography takes away from that romantic, emotional intimacy. That's interesting stuff. That's interesting stuff. Boy, we got to get this turned around. We got to get this. This is not what Scripture says about biblical marriage. I just read through Song of Solomon. I had to do a little study on Song of Solomon because there's a friend of mine gave me a question online here. And it's interesting that the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation from the Hebrew of Song of Solomon, when you see the words love in Song of Solomon, you would absolutely think they're talking about romantic love. But the Septuagint translates it into the word agape, which is, God's kind of love for us. Over and over again, it does that. I thought that was I thought for sure it would have the word eros, because it certainly seems like in the language that it's talking about romantic, erotic kind of love with the word eros. But no, it uses the word agape over and over again when translating the Hebrew to the Septuagint for Song of Solomon. So with all that being said, we got to get this turned around because Christ is winning. He is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Until next time, this is the Postmillennial Man.